Good afternoon, and welcome to the State of Analytics and How You Can Survive It, a complimentary webinar from HealthSystemCIO.com. Just a little housekeeping before we get started today. My name is Anthony Guerra. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of HealthSystemCIO.com, and I'll be your moderator today. We encourage you to go ahead and send in your questions at any time. You can type them into the Q&A box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. We'll leave the default set to all panelists. Like I said, you can send them in when you like, but we'll take them later in the program. You can download the deck using the URL on your screen. There's a shortened URL at the bottom of each slide, and I will send it out in the chat box, so plenty of chances to get a hold of the deck. And we are recording today's event, so there will be an archive available, usually within 2 business days, if not sooner, and a separate registration is required. You'll get an email when it's ready. Just so you see how we're going to spend our time today, we're going to go 40 to 45 minutes. First, we're going to hear from Gene Thomas, VP and CIO at Memorial Hospital and Memorial Physician Clinics at Gulfport. Then we're going to have our Q&A with Gene. So without further delay, I'm going to turn it over to our speaker, Gene Thomas. Gene, thanks for joining us today.
You're welcome, Anthony. Thank you very much. So I'll give you some information on kind of our view and my view on analytics. I'll walk you through a little bit about what we've done here at Memorial. A little bit about myself. I've been here about 7 years in the role, and about half my career has been in healthcare. The other half, up until 1999, was in the pure technology side of the business, and got into healthcare working for LSU School of Medicine on a project in 1999, rather. So I want to give you a little bit of background on Memorial. So we are a not-for-profit hospital, safety net provider hospital in Gulfport, Mississippi, 445 beds. You can read some of the data there. One of the things we like to point out is that we have 85 owned Memorial clinics. So this is everything from family practice through multi-specialties, and those are all owned and employed physicians and staff in those clinics. We're proud to say we achieved meaningful use in 2011, both on the inpatient and eligible provider side. And we sit on the Gulf Coast with a very high mix of Medicare, Medicaid, and the uninsured. Level 2 Trauma Center, there's some of our volumes I just thought I would share with the audience. I like to say that we have a pretty high volume of unmanaged, manageable conditions, or so we believe. We know that anecdotally. We have every intention, and they're starting to get some insight by use of our analytics as to how many people typically through the ED come through, but come in with a unmanaged, manageable condition, and of course the goal is to manage those conditions. A little bit about where we came from. So we're surrounded by some for-profit hospitals from HCA and CHS. We have the only behavioral health on the Gulf Coast. And during Hurricane Katrina, which is that nice picture you see on the right, you'll notice that the eye went through New Orleans, but the dirty side, they call it, came right through us. We had the direct hit. And so during Hurricane Katrina, 400 of our employees lost their homes overnight. And although hospitals are not supposed to be places of refuge, people came here obviously because they were hurt or sick. We had people coming here because they had no place else to go. It was either come here or stay out in the elements because there were weeks and weeks and weeks without gas, electricity, water, and therefore food. So it was a very unique time for Memorial Hospital, but the staff, both the clinical staff and the support staff, really rallied and did a good job of staying open during Hurricane Katrina. So it wiped out a lot of the medical practices in the area. And we were concerned, administration and the board were concerned that clinicians were going to leave the market. I mean, their practice went away. What I mean by that is their patients went away, or their practice, meaning their building, literally went away. And so without any of the traditional pro forma financials and other normal and customary documents, the board and the administration staff got together and decided to offer 100% of the medical staff employment if they wanted it. And that was our first step into growing our clinic footprint. Because we had an opportunity because a lot of physicians liked the employment model, and a lot were having trouble rebuilding practices, obviously, because patients went away and, of course, their building went away. A little bit about Katrina. A little bit about our service distribution. We're right on the Gulf Coast. I was commenting that we are literally the facility, the main facility is less than half a mile from the Gulf of Mexico, where hurricanes like to hang out. But we currently have 73 physical locations in a 3-county area along the Gulf Coast. So we are directly due east of New Orleans. We're probably the largest system between New Orleans and Mobile, Alabama. So some realities and predictions I thought I'd share. We are not in an ACO or a shared savings environment. with our payers. But I like to say we need to act like one anyway because we are already accountable. People come through our ED, and I think I shared we have about 75,000, 76,000 visits through our ED, and we're accountable for that care, and in many cases we're accountable for that cost of care. So I like to say that's a reality we have. The predictions are we believe we need to prepare for clinical integration at some point regionally, but right now we're using our own footprint for our own clinical integration with our service distribution with those 85 clinics. But we wanted to, part of my role, I believe, was to pour the foundation and develop capabilities using analytics to help in decision-making for those other bullets that I've listed there. Clearly, it is about quality initiatives and population health management. I just wonder how many times that's going to be said during this presentation. I'll try to minimize it. Revenue cycle and the financial components around that. So it's not just revenue cycle in terms of how quickly the bills get out, what are your AR days, but is what is your cost per case and what is your cost of variation. And really pouring the foundation to be able to manage and have the tools so that as we transition from fee-for-service to fee-for-value or something else, I'm hoping that we can be prepared, and that's our goal, that we've got the data and the tools to make that transition smoother than we otherwise would. A little bit about where we came from. We had 3 disparate systems between our inpatient, our clinics, and our ED. We'd had those in place for a long time, particularly on the inpatient side and many ancillaries. We wanted to have a fully integrated system and the analytics that support that, right? Your electronic health record, your data capture, and I know it does more than that, but largely it's your data capture, and then you apply the analytics so that you get something out of there, you get the data out of there that allows you to make data-driven decisions about your care, contract negotiation, clinical improvements. That's what we wanted to have, and that's where we went. When we started this process, we said we have 2 key decisions. One is who is our electronic health record or EMR vendor, and who is the source of our EDW and the analytics that ride on top of that. We consider those decisions equally as important. I presume most people do in my role, although I do talk to some people who consider the EMR decision the most important, and the EDW or analytics a little secondary, and I think we just take a different approach there. I'd like to show this slide. When we first started talking about this, I was giving a meeting. The chief of staff was at the end of the table. He wasn't paying attention to a word I was saying. He was writing on some document. Little did I know, he stopped me, slid this piece of paper down the table and said, "This is what I want." And so he actually was paying attention. We turned that drawing into an icon that you see there, an emblem that talks about patients being at the center as we focus on satisfaction, clinical outcomes, and financial performance. So we try to use our analytics for a lot of things, but one of them is if we stay focused on the patient, we hope that we can certainly improve outcomes and improve satisfaction and therefore the financial performance. So a CIO's role, this is obvious, I believe. All the infrastructure, which is foundational, the EHR is table stakes, patient portal, et cetera. I won't read all those. Down at the bottom, supporting the C-suite is a must. And that's a large part of the role in general for a CIO, but also when it comes to analytics. Here is a stream of consciousness about all of the things that I work on, and many of the CIOs on the phone call probably do as well. They're all serious topics, but really, a CIO's role kind of mirrors the chief analytics officer's role, at least initially, and provide the analytics and data to support decisions for many things, some of which I've discussed and talked about. Eliminating waste not being the least of the important, but certainly with our payer mix, trying to get down to a Medicare cost structure is something that I don't think you can do without having robust analytics in place and then using those analytics. So, disclaimer from this point forward, a lot of the topics I express herein are mine personally and not necessarily representative of Gulfport. Why analytics and why now? And I kind of like to say now is almost too late. In this day and age where value-based purchasing is becoming more and more the norm, certainly if you're an ACO, I don't know how you would possibly be an ACO and understand attribution and understand the cost of your beneficiaries without having analytics in place. You really got to be able to measure your outcomes and your cost. And we all talk about cost and cost pressures and reduction of reimbursements. My personal opinion is you can't cut costs. You can't cut your way out of margin pressure forever. If you look at some of the national trends, look at what Moody and Fitch comments are and releases about not-for-profit hospitals, which is obviously the space we're in, you see on a regular basis, at least I see, bond ratings and downgrades. The prediction, based on who you read or who you listen to, is that that will continue as reductions in reimbursement and other pressures to midnight rule things come into play. It goes back to cost and analytics to help you understand your cost, understand how you can reduce cost without impacting outcomes. So the fallacy, can you really reconcile numbers in different applications? Maybe. Got a lot of normalization to do, and you got to make sure people understand what they're reconciling. Silos of data, sorry, but everybody gets that. And that magical thinking that if we put in an EMR, we got this. And although it's required, you can't do analytics without that data capture, it is not the end game. But a little bit of magical thinking in some of the people that I've talked to or read about. So the role of analytics, I won't read each bullet to you. It looks like we missed a bullet number 3. But the point is, what should be number 3, which is number 4, is can you actually, after you pay for all of this, can you actually net some savings? Or if you're in an ACO market, can you actually net shared savings? After you pay for all of the IT, the case managers you need to manage the population, and if you're in an ACO, you're bonusing doctors, and if you're people like us, you may be giving them incentives for quality and patient satisfaction. But can you really do it when you put all this in place? And how long, do you do that before you get the law of diminishing returns? What I mean by that in the ACO world, at least, right, they keep ratcheting down the benchmarks, so it's harder and harder to continue to prove shared savings as the metrics continue to change. So baseline scenario for community hospitals like us, typically we use legacy applications to look at the cost by service line, by DRG, and by cost center. But there really wasn't a risk adjustment, a drill down, or any modeling capabilities. And that's kind of key, at least in my mind, for where we need to go going forward in terms of building our skill set and building our capabilities. And even us and the ACO people typically look at last year's risk-adjusted benchmarks as they do their analysis. So some of the thoughts that I have and we had was to identify all the data, and I really should have said all the relevant data, and move it into the EDW. While you build the interfaces that are going to feed the EDW, you got to do a lot of mapping of the data. You've got to go through some upgrade hell to make sure that everybody's on the most current version to minimize the things that we all know about, where interfaces break when vendors change from version 1 to version 2 to version 3. You've got to make sure you apply the resources, and when I say resources, I mean human and financial. You got to justify that to leadership, because in some cases it's new. So what's the setup for it? Well, some say that a lot of traditional administrators that aren't in ACOs don't necessarily believe the models or the solutions. In talking to people about this, so this isn't necessarily just my thought, some say they don't understand the ACO model and why they would do it, but they accept the inevitability that the payment model is going to change. Some subset, I would say, that I've talked to or read about don't want to change and don't believe it's going to happen. Some say that the ACO model is going to fade away. I'm not qualified to know if that's true or not, but I'm going to assume it's going to remain, and that more and more fee for value is going to be the place. Most places aren't clinically integrated, so you need analytics to help you with that clinical integration to be smart about what you do. Certainly, if you don't have risk contracts but are going down that path, or even value-based purchasing and all the things we've discussed, that's part of the setup. You need the tool in place and the foundation to be able to navigate the waters as those payment models change. And some aren't committed to the triple aim. It's amazing how much effort. The Google I did on Sunday night, I believe, returned 75 million hits on the triple aim. But I don't see many people talking about it. That just may be my narrow view of the world. So for a not-for-profit hospital on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, I like to say we're doing analytics in a big way. And some say that seems contradictory on the surface. I mean, you got your largest payer is the federal government. What do you need the analytics for? You know what you've got. Well, all the more reason we need the analytics. I like to say, and this is kind of the internal words we use, it's not only wise, it's necessary, particularly as the state Medicaid re-racks and redoes kind of the reimbursement models, certainly for the uninsured and underinsured. So I ask people, ask yourself, is anyone else in the country doing it? is the largest payer if you're in a high CMS reimbursement model, moving away from fee-for-service to fee-for-value. And are the private payers doing that? So this is some of the reasons why we're doing analytics. You know, the usual facts about us, as I said, with our 85 clinics, we're the dominant market player. With our service distribution, our medical staff is largely employed. Our medical staff is now, as of 1 year ago, on a new fully integrated EMR. So we've got that all-important primary care that's integrated in so that as patients move through transitions of care and move out of our ED or out of an inpatient encounter, we can do that all-important follow-up that needs to take place to lower cost and help manage that unmanageable condition. Our inpatient volume is still high, believe it or not, and not declining yet, but I have every expectation it will. Our counterparts in our geography, we look at their data and their inpatient volumes are declining. It's a reality. And, you know, the usual facts about a not-for-profit hospital is there were two knobs you would turn, right? Volume and payer mix. Well, there's a lot more knobs now on the dashboard, and analytics helps you, aid you, not completely drives it, but aids you in the decision-making process as you move those knobs other than volume and payer mix. Now, some people say it's the payer mix. Yeah. Some people say it is, or maybe it's your cost structure, and I think that's something that everybody has to look at across the board. So not so unusual facts about us. I talked about our acquisition of primary care. Many use just the RVU metric, and it's kind of a blind eye to quality, right? It's just about production. Well, you need your analytics to help support your quality improvement plans. It's going to give you better insights and deeper insights than you would otherwise have. So I don't read all the bullets to you here. I will say one of the most important things that we're focusing on is getting that robust quality data on ambulatory. Because, again, that's where the largest number of encounters are, and that's how you manage patients and move from a system that takes care of sick people to move to a system that keeps people healthy and prevents them from being ill, if you will. So the baseline, you know, the triple aim, I don't know, I kind of see, for many people, ourselves included, prior to our recent moves with analytics and an integrated EMR, you're kind of flying blind. How can you really look at improving patient experience, reducing cost and population, unless you put a whole lot of money into disparate systems, or you get fully integrated and have robust analytics. So in our case, you know, we're not really, like I said, we're not in an ACO or really a regional CI scenario. There were a number of hospitals that got together and wanted to create a regional clinically integrated network, not state-sponsored, but sponsored by a group of hospitals getting together. For now, we elected not to participate and focus on our own efforts and our own issues and our own opportunities, I should say, by focusing on the analytics that we're starting to get and using those for all of the things that typically are, and I know are obvious, I've talked about, which is improving quality, removing waste, removing costs, looking at cost per case, looking at the unmanaged manageable conditions, and using our primary care for best and highest use to manage those patients. And this is actually a quote I picked up from someone at HIMSS, that many of the providers, traditionally, typically primary care, provide care without knowing the cost or quality or patient satisfaction. Yeah, we got a view of it, but is it projectable? Is it statistically projectable? I think that needs, for people like us, that needs to change. So for people that are not ready for fee for value and don't really pay attention to triple aim, I'm putting on here, consider the quadruple increment, and I'm going to give that to a colleague of mine, Dr. Variance, who actually in many discussions we've had, because I talked about the quadruple increment, which are these four things. So, you know, right now, maximize the fee-for-service revenue and use an analytics to do that. Screenings, people coming in for those routine things that actually have revenue and in some cases margin with them, depending on the payer. Look at your analytics to reduce cost in variation, because that exists today. All of us have it, and we can use analytics in a fee-for-service model, obviously, to look at variation, regardless of whether it benefits, it really benefits the payers and it benefits the patients, but it should benefit us in reducing cost. So these are the four things in the quadruple increment, and I like to say these things are important because analytics is important, rather, to them, because you can't improve what you don't measure. So very important. So when you do this and look at the triple aim or this quadruple increment, quintuple increment rather, you know, it gives you the ability to dip your toe in the water, or at least that's what most of us are doing now with value-based purchasing. This allows you to move quicker and put more than just your toe in the water, get both feet in the water and get ankle deep, and prepare yourself for fee-for-value. Many say, fee-for-value resistant organizations is the last bullet. They're typically dominant and profitable and no volume declines. They lack a burning motivation. Many say that'll change. I'm one of them. That's going to change is my belief. And at least here, we are trying to position the organization, again, to have the foundation and the tools to make that transition as painless as possible or as seamless as possible, knowing that it's going to be difficult. So why would you look at doing some of these moves and putting analytics in place now? It allows you to play with monopoly money is what I say. You kind of get to simulate the requirements you're going to have in a fee-for-value environment as opposed to one day waking up and realize you're in that environment and have to figure out how am I going to get the data and the analytics and the decision-making down to do it. Start now. So you can look at your quality improvement programs. You can understand where can I actually move the needle, reduce cost, reduce waste before you're actually at risk of losing reimbursement as a result of that. Start to talk about how you would use analytics and the data out of analytics. Certainly, you talk about negotiating contracts, so you can show that constant improvement to your payers, as opposed to walking in one day and say, look, we leapfrogged over a cavern. Show that incremental step. So what's the approach? I said it already, simulation. Simulation's done in most other industries. You have a preseason. The NFL has a preseason for a reason. There's no reason that we in healthcare shouldn't have a preseason on getting the analytics and the data in place we're going to need once the reality of payment models changes and our reimbursement therefore changes as well. So cost, kind of the real part, right? The obvious targets on cost are what are listed here. That won't get you there. Personal opinion again, not that I have a moral hospital. I think you've got to look at other things than just those costs and use analytics to help identify areas where you can either increase revenue, but in this case specifically reduce some of your cost. So costs aren't typically where they believe to be, or at least when I talk to people and try to educate myself on where are the costs, where should we focus on cost reduction? Yeah. Are they in service lines? Sure, but they won't get you there. They're embedded in variation. So these are all the places where they're not typically believed to be. They're believed to be in areas like this: benefits, staffing, service lines, and supplies. This is really where you particularly look at that direct cost on DRGs. Remove the waste there, remove the overhead, remove the variation. Revenue cycle, lean analysis or lean type processes. You get iterative improvements to understand your cost per case. And again, that will have a play in variability. Revenue cycle, what I've experienced and talked to colleagues who say they experience the same thing, is so many people touch out of so many different systems some aspect of revenue cycle that by the time it gets to, in some cases, not all, where you want to make decisions, that data has been molded so many different ways, that piece of clay, that you can't really tell what it is. And therefore, people make decisions potentially without understanding the source of truth or the modifications that have taken place with that data. If you get a discipline of analytics, and I'll talk about the discipline in a little bit, that will help remove some of that exception handling, if you will. We used to talk about no margin, no mission. Certainly, I would say an ACO player, or some of us that aren't in ACOs, but as we move more to fee for value, it'll change probably from no margin, no mission to no outcome, no income, because we'll be paid on outcomes. So, summary of what you might do is look at your PMPM on your ambulatory cost and utilization, certainly your quality. Discuss revenue cycle with the medical staff and the physicians. Some understand it, some think they understand it and don't. Some really have never, there was never a motivation for them to have a knowledge of it, and nobody really had a motivation to go provide them the knowledge. That's changing. And so make sure they're involved in the analytics discussion. That has been a pretty valuable asset for me and us here at Memorial. So some specific examples. I'll just read the first one. When you look at readmissions, a lot of people look at readmissions just from your inpatient. In our case, that's just 16,000 discharges. But what about from different venues of care? How can you really get a handle on what can you do to reduce readmissions if you don't look at that post-acute care differences and root causes? So legacy applications typically look at your DRG cost per center. No, I think that actually this may be a repeat, but these are some of the topics when it comes to the baseline scenarios for these hospitals. Understanding the casualty of variance across the system. This is really intended to share at least my thoughts on the importance of primary care and how if you're going to reduce cost and improve the outcome, it starts with primary care and how you make sure there's compliance and you feed that primary care with those patients that need to be there on that regular basis, as opposed to them coming in and you start the process too late when it could have been prevented. So kind of the elephant in the room that we talk about here is if we start taking risk or are at risk, will we actually improve the quality, reduce ambulatory sensitivity to admissions and readmissions? That should be a goal. That needs to be something that you actually have to try to do. Our negative margin or positive margin cases being removed, again, when you cross that cavern and make that transition from fee-for-service to fee-for-value, you got to be very careful how you do that so you don't cannibalize yourself as you're reducing your inpatient volume before you're getting paid for fee-for-value. So you can use analytics to avoid readmissions and value-based purchasing penalties. These things I think are all obvious, or at least I hope they are for the audience. I would say that one of the things you want to look at is, right now when you do it, the benefit financially is going to be the payer. But what are your observed versus expected outcomes and costs? Figure that out now before you're forced to do it. So some of these topics, in the essence of time, I want to kind of move on to what our path has been here. One of the answers is go buy some analytics and develop a plan now. Figure out where you can improve and prepare for risk and increase value-based purchasing metrics before they come into reality. Get the stakeholders engaged. It starts with leadership, I will tell you that. Most places that I look to say educate me and us on how you actually use meaningful analytics, it starts with leadership saying this is something we're going to focus on as a strategic goal. So what was our path here at Memorial? I'm going to talk about our approach, what we did, how we did it, and what the result was. Building a consensus for analytics was very important. So what did we do? We talked to everyone, and I don't necessarily mean all 3,200 employees, but a very wide net was cast and talked to people about the value of integrated clinical and financial systems. What is an EDW? You'll find a lot of the staff and a lot of the clinicians don't even know what an EDW is. Explain what that is. Talk about capabilities, talk about data visualization. Get into the mindset of the C-suite, the board, the staff, the bench, and the clinicians. Find out the starting point of where they're from so you know what education needs to take place to make sure they understand and everybody gets on the same page. But that mindset of where those constituents are is very important. And I say get stranded out of town with your chief of staff. That actually happened. My chief of staff and I were going out of town for a one-day trip. Because of weather, it turned into a 3-day trip. And I can tell you we had discussions about analytics that we never would have had we not gotten stranded out of town. It's actually a good story because he fully engaged in understanding the importance of it and then actually what it means for patients and outcomes, which is where he focused. And then he focused on, of course, the financial aspect of it because that's how you reinvest in yourself and buy the right equipment and supplies for patients principally. If you don't get physicians involved, it's going to fail. Physicians, that's my personal opinion, physicians are going to fail. But that was a very valuable thing to spend that time with the chief of staff. So when you go and talk to a lot of people and cast this net, define analytics. Make sure they understand the definition. Explain that without analytics, there's a risky future, or some might say no future. Define data governance and define data integrity. It's not that people don't understand those concepts, just make sure everybody has a common definition. And in an engagement standpoint, first you need to assess what is the engagement of the right people. Once you understand that engagement, you need to move the needle to where you want it to be. How do you obtain it? And then how do you maintain that engagement? And I like to say, why do you want people engaged? Well, most people right now, at least in a health system like ours, are in the mode of treat and release. Patient comes in, we treat them, we release them, as opposed to managing them. So that's part of that assessment of that they understand that we're going to be doing things differently in the future than we're doing today. We're going to be getting paid and reimbursed for health as opposed to treating conditions. And explain to people, analytics outside of healthcare has been used for a long time. I'm hoping that some of these topics here are familiar to some of the listeners here. Share of wallet, customer relationship management, lifetime value of a customer. I actually asked what time the lifetime value of a baby was, and it was an interesting answer. But many of the companies we all know on the consumer side, they all use analytics. We've been using it for decades. It's not a new concept. They wouldn't survive in this day and age without analytics. It's just newer in healthcare. But communicate that to people. Try to draw a bridge and try to draw a connection between things that they can associate with as consumers in their personal life. Then you go out and show a bunch of slides like this and like this so they understand a little bit about it, show them some data visualization, and go out and get more consensus. Get specifics, get real-world examples, and encourage scenarios, even if you have to do it by assignment, which is what we did, and I'm going to share those with you in a moment. And, you know, you've got to blend people who are worried about the future with people who are worried about today. We tend to become, for the right reasons, very focused on today because we're taking care of patients and going through encounters and doing business as usual, but we've got to make sure we blend in people who are worried about the future, and part of that future anyway is how we're going to get paid differently. When you do that, this one, even though I qualified it, this one is about Memorial. And build it and they will come, maybe, maybe not. I will tell you that once we began to discuss it and show them what this meant, they became very hungry. And one of my analysts said, you know, now we've got to feed the beast, Gene, that we've built this. And people are coming and saying, how come I can't see this, have this, compare this type of attitude? They really engage once they realize I can look at data differently than I looked at it in the past, as opposed to rows and columns, if you will, and reports. I now have a different way of looking at data and correlating that data. This does support the reason, rather the need for a dedicated business intelligence or analytics team. I don't know how you'd be successful if you don't have the right team that's constantly looking at the source of truth, making sure the data is normalized, making sure that all the things about the data are important before people start to analyze and do things with it. So what we did is we went around and asked various people as we were going through our selection process, what would you like to see out of analytics? And this came from the users, our director level users. It's interesting, if you look at number 8, which is falls analysis, that actually came from our Vice President of Human Resources. To look at falls with analytics, what is the length of experience of the nursing staff on the floor? What's their background with the hospital? How long have they been with us? Those types of things. And that was interesting that she wanted to look at falls analysis from that perspective. I just want to give a little detail. I'm not going to read this. This is what we did on scenario number 4 with blood analysis. This is how specific it got. And actually, when we went to VTE, it got much more specific as we went through and looked at what did somebody, particularly in quality in this case, want to see out of an analytics strategy and application and solution. The result that we had was a fully integrated EHR, captured the data. We have a system that captures cost. EDW is in place and populated daily. Our analytics applications are in place. And there's this continuing education of the skills of the humans that use that analytics. And that's an ongoing process that probably won't change. It won't be the same scale, but that's very important to make sure the education is there and how to use the application properly. A couple comments I want to make before we wrap up. Again, I want to make the disclaimer because this is my opinion. I apologize to show this slide, but we all know there's all kinds of data both internally and those registries and claims database elements are external data sources. There's tons of them. We all know the problem with all this data sitting out there supports an EDW. But I'd like to say, if, you know, from a 50,000 foot standpoint, I'd like to say, Houston, we have a problem. And the problem is at least these 4 constituents in healthcare. You know, I kind of want to akin it to a lawyer-client relationship, right? Day one, they have opposing and diverse business models. Lawyers typically charge by the hour. Clients don't want to use a whole lot of hours. Well, if we look at these 4 constituents here on this slide, you typically have a payer who at least wants to pay. They're in the risk business, right? They want to pay as little as possible, if you will. You have patients, blanket statements, not all, but some that typically aren't engaged, aren't compliant, and don't really want to pay. You've got the industry vendors who are doing what they should be doing, which is try to provide solutions so they can attach to a budget that a provider has. And then you've got the provider who cares for patients. My personal view, until we get all 4, and we have, my point is with these 4 different constituents, we somewhat have opposing business models. The provider wants to be reimbursed for the services they provide. The payer wants to, of course, in the case of one large payer, They want to ratchet down the reimbursement and pay for outcome. Patients don't always want to be compliant. So we're all at somewhat odds. And until we all get in the same room at the same time is my point. I think we, as taxpayers, have a problem. Just my personal opinion. The other observation I have is you look at the continuum of care. There's the not-for-profit provider on the left and all the other constituents that we deal with. And I kind of pose the question of, guess what the average margin is for those various constituents, or said another way, guess who typically has the lowest margin? And I think we probably all know the answer to that question. So some final thoughts. Without analytics, you're going to live in a world where the absence of your data, because of the absence of your data, you're only going to be able to rely on and defend the data of the payer. They've got the claims data. We don't. Back to the previous slide, everybody needs to be on the same page. You would think it would make sense that we would have claims data regardless of where the venue of care was. So if you don't have analytics, I think you live in a world where these three things are a reality that you might want to avoid. So final recommendations, look at the AAA and get some analytics up and running ASAP. Don't fly blind. Make sure that you're actually getting the foundation in place and you're ready to actually simulate that before it becomes reality. And the road to success is filled with potentially prescriptions like this that might help you get there. That's a slide that we used before. So that's it, Anthony. I want to stay on time. I hope that was helpful.
I think it was extremely helpful, Gene, and I think our audience, I'm sure, got a lot out of it in your comprehensive slide deck. So, with that said, we have a few minutes left for Q&A. Gene, let me start out by talking to you a little bit about data. You know, we could put analytics package on top of data, but if the data, you know, the old adage, garbage in, garbage out, if the data is questionable, I suppose even the best analytics packages aren't going to do much with it that's useful. Talk to me about the idea of, you know, not putting the cart before the horse and making sure that your clinicians, your frontline clinicians understand what has to go in order for valuable things to be pulled out.
Sure, it's a good question and a starting point. So we first try that education I talked about understanding data integrity and data governance, so that when you talk to them about, you have to chart this way, every data element needs to be charted this way, otherwise we can't track it. That structured data is so very important. So it's an education process. And actually in some cases we've been able to show, here's data that we had before, and look at how unclear of an answer it seems to give, and look at data that was charted consistently, where every data element was put in there the same way by the clinicians, physicians, and nursing staff and ancillaries, and how much different that looks in terms of how valid that looks. So data integrity, sources of truth are very, very, very important, or like you said, the analytics application isn't going to give you what you want.
Very good. You mentioned that it's tough to get physician leaders on board. Any more advice on how to reach them and get physicians engaged in the analytics strategy?
Yeah, again, personal opinions and maybe some experience here. So, you know, we selected, and I don't want to say targeted, but identified a few physicians that really wanted to learn and engage what we were doing, and explain to them the revenue cycle impact and the importance of trying to focus on that variability. Combine that with the reality of what's going to happen as payment models change. Fee for value, value-based purchasing, two-midnight rule, et cetera. A lot of them understand it generically, and I don't want to make it blame. Some of them understand it very well, but typically they're busy taking care of patients. And so I don't want to say it's tough, because physicians are obviously smart people, but you've got to find the right ones that are going to engage and say, I want to learn more about this. I want to understand informatics. I want to understand this analytics thing. And when you start to show them data visualization, you know, rows and columns are not fun to look at in reports. When you can say, look, let me show you an outlier. Let me drill down. More importantly, let me show you the inliers, because it's easy to start with the inliers to move the needle than it is with the outlier.
All right, very good, very good. How do you get around the all patients are different versus standardization of description to optimize downstream analytics? That's
a tough one. you've got to start with standardization to begin with, because that's where you're going to get your biggest return. That's where in the bell curve most of it's going to be. All patients are different. You certainly got to break them down by disease type, and therefore the care plans that you apply to those conditions. And I hope I'm getting on the right part of the question. But you've got to sit there and look at the different types of patient populations, look at the conditions, and make sure that you can analyze those conditions both individually and then as a cohort. If that makes sense.
Very good. Let's talk about money, getting budget for this kind of thing. So you spend quite a bit on an EMR. You go to your board, you tell them what it's going to cost. Maybe you did that let's say typically where most folks in the industry are. You did that a few years ago. You went to your board. You got a whole boatload of money for an EMR. You put that in. Now it's time you have to go back to the board and ask for another boatload of money for analytics. Is it possible you encounter hey, I thought we were done, and I know you made the point that you're not done. It's stakes to play, but tell me about that type of dynamic.
Sure, and Anthony, in our case, when I kind of began the initiative to say, let's build consensus around a new EMR as opposed to disparate systems. When I was doing the budgeting process and building consensus and talking about what we needed to have, I actually wrapped analytics and the EMR into one project and went with one app. Now, that said, to more specific to your question, I still had to break out and say, this is why analytics is important. So that education took place at the administrative level, not that it really needed to. Most of the administrators, my co-administrators, obviously get this. But at the board level, I shared with them commentary and articles and narratives and things within healthcare and the need for analytics, but I also shared with them how analytics has been used for a long time outside of healthcare, and then married that to our payment model is going to change, right? The two-midnight rule was coming upon us. They already knew about their sequestration, the reduction in reimbursement across the board. So they kind of got the fact that we got them there by education, that we needed to wrap this into one project. I would say even if it would have been a separate thing, the presentation and the build of the need would have been the same. I think there's plenty of very smart people out there that say you really, it's going to be difficult to move forward without the analytics.
Okay, I think we have time for about one more question now. Good questions come in. Can clinical data be packaged neatly for analysis? As a physician, we are told to chart a certain way, but it is getting the patient into the model as opposed to getting the model into the patient. Not everything can be measured.
That is correct. Not everything can be measured. And the answer is yes, you can. You still need to capture as much of the relevant data that is actionable as you possibly can. That said, you'll never be able to get everything in there that you would ideally want, or at least it won't go in the same way. Every patient's unique. For a physician that asked that question, if it was a physician, yes, you still need to chart the same way. Otherwise, the variability of the data is going to be potentially wide enough you may not know it is the point. That's the point. You may believe you've got good data, and you actually don't. And the way to ensure that is that discipline of everything charted the same way. That is, at least it can be in structured data. Obviously, there's a lot of unstructured data out there, but you want to focus on making sure that everything is charted the same way, just like is done in many other industries. So you make sure that you understand when something's falling outside of the norm.
Excellent, Gene. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your participation in the extensive presentation and answering our questions. So, as I mentioned to everyone, you'll receive an email when our archive is prepared, usually within 2 business days, if not sooner. Folks attending who hold the CHIME CHCIO certification get 1 credit for each of our events they attend, so let CHIME know you've attended unless you asked us to, and we will. Sponsorship opportunities, contact Nancy Wilcox. She can get you more information on that. Questions and comments, you can, general things, you can email me. And you can go to our website to view our upcoming schedule and see the last 12 months of archived events. So again, I want to thank Gene. I have a feeling we'll be seeing him again in our events. He did an excellent job. Thank you to our audience, and everybody have a wonderful day.